The glass of whiskey hit her uniform before anyone saw it coming. Amber liquid spread across her chest, the ice cubes bouncing off her ribbons and clattering to the floor of the officers' club. Staff Sergeant Marcus Vega stood swaying, his face flushed with alcohol and something darker, something that had been building since she'd walked into the ready room 3 weeks ago. His words slurred but carried across the sudden silence. "Take a shower, Captain. You smell like desperation and diversity quotas." The room froze. Every conversation died mid-sentence. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward the corner table where Captain Nadia Kasra stood, soaked, motionless, her dark eyes locked on Vega's face with an intensity that made the temperature drop 10 degrees. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers loose, weight balanced on both feet in a stance most people wouldn't recognize. But 3 men in that room recognized it immediately, and they were already moving, already trying to reach Vega before he said what everyone knew was coming next. They were too late. Vega leaned forward, his breath reeking of cheap bourbon and cheaper judgment. "Why don't you run along?" And he never finished the sentence. What happened next would become legend at Naval Air Station Oceana, whispered about in ready rooms and repeated with increasing embellishment at every subsequent gathering. But the security camera footage, reviewed later by increasingly senior officers, told the unembellished truth. Captain Kasra moved with a speed and precision that seemed to compress time itself. Her right hand caught Vega's wrist mid-gesture, rotating it in a motion too fast to follow. Her left struck once, twice, 3 times throat, solar plexus, jaw impacts delivered with surgical accuracy and devastating effect. Vega's knees buckled. His eyes rolled back. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings, unconscious before his shoulder hit the floor. The entire sequence lasted exactly 2.3 seconds. Kasra stepped back, her breathing unchanged, her expression unreadable. She looked down at the unconscious sergeant for a long moment, then lifted her eyes to scan the frozen faces around her. When she spoke, her voice carried the same controlled calm it always did in the cockpit. "Someone get the duty officer. And someone else might want to check if Sergeant Vega needs medical attention." She walked toward the door, her boots leaving wet footprints on the polished floor. Behind her, chaos erupted, shouts, movement, the sudden rush of bodies toward the fallen man. But Kasra didn't look back. She never looked back. What none of them knew yet, what the investigation would eventually uncover, was that before she'd been a Navy pilot, before she'd earned her wings and her call sign and her reputation for ice-cold precision under fire, Nadia Kasra had spent 6 years doing things the Navy didn't advertise in recruitment videos. The duty officer arrived 17 minutes later to find Staff Sergeant Vega sitting against the wall with an ice pack pressed to his jaw, Captain Kasra standing at attention in the hallway outside, and 20 witnesses who couldn't quite agree on what they'd seen except that it had been fast, efficient, and probably justified. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, the duty officer, was a helicopter pilot with 15 years of service and a finely tuned sense for when a situation was about to explode into paperwork that would consume her entire weekend. She looked at Kasra, then at Vega, then back at Kasra. "Captain, would you like to tell me what happened?" Kasra's voice remained level. "Staff Sergeant Vega threw his drink on me, ma'am. He made inappropriate comments. I defended myself. He lost consciousness. I called for assistance." Chen turned to the nearest witness, a young lieutenant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Is that accurate?" The lieutenant nodded, then found his voice. "Yes, ma'am, except Captain Kasra didn't just defend herself. He trailed off, searching for words. "She moved like someone who's done this before. A lot." This was the moment when someone should have asked the obvious question. The moment when someone should have pulled Kasra's full-service record instead of just the aviation portions. But the Navy is a large organization, and information moves slowly through official channels, especially when some of that information is classified at levels most personnel officers will never see. So instead, Chen made the practical decision. "Sergeant Vega, you're confined to quarters pending investigation. Captain Kasra, you're restricted to base. Both of you will submit written statements by 0800 tomorrow. Dismissed." Kasra saluted, executed a perfect about-face, and walked toward the BOQ. Behind her, the whispers started immediately. They would continue for hours, growing louder and more speculative with each retelling. By morning, half the air station would have heard some version of the story. By the afternoon, it would reach the commanding officer's desk. And by the following week, someone would finally think to ask the question that should have been asked immediately. Who exactly was Captain Nadia Kasra before she'd become a Hornet pilot? The answer to that question was buried in personnel files that required special clearance to access. Files that contained operations reports from places the Navy preferred not to discuss. Files that explained why Kasra moved the way she did, why her hands bore small scars most people never noticed, why she could end a confrontation in 2.3 seconds without breaking a sweat. Before she'd been Captain Kasra, call sign Surgeon, flying FA-18 Super Hornets off the deck of aircraft carriers, she'd been something else entirely. She'd been Petty Officer First Class Kasra, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Most people called them SEAL Team 6, though that designation was technically retired in 1987. For 6 years, Nadia Kasra had done things that would never appear in her official biography. She'd breached compounds in countries that officially didn't host American military operations. She'd extracted high-value targets from situations that officially never occurred. She'd learned to move through darkness like it was her natural element, to make decisions in fractions of seconds, to deliver violence with the same precision most people brought to filling out tax forms. The Navy had recruited her straight out of Annapolis, recognizing something in her combination of physical capability and emotional control that made her ideal for special operations. She'd volunteered for training that broke 70% of candidates in the first month. She'd completed missions that would remain classified for the next 50 years. And then, after 6 years and 2 significant injuries that officially never happened, she'd made a choice. She'd left DEVGRU, gone to flight school, earned her wings, and become the kind of pilot who approached air combat with the same methodical intensity she'd once brought to close-quarters battle. The transition hadn't been seamless. Fighter pilots and special operators occupied different cultural spaces within the military, spoke different professional languages, valued different qualities. But Kasra had adapted the same way she'd adapted to everything else through relentless competence and absolute refusal to acknowledge doubt. What she hadn't adapted to, what still grated against something fundamental in her psychology, was the casual disrespect that certain men seemed to feel entitled to express. The knowing looks, the dismissive comments, the assumption that her presence in a combat squadron was somehow a political statement rather than the earned result of demonstrated capability. Staff Sergeant Vega had been the latest but far from the first. The difference was that Vega had been drunk enough to get physical, and Kasra's response had been instinctive muscle memory from years of training that most Navy pilots never received. Now, walking toward her quarters in the humid Virginia night, she considered the consequences. There would be an investigation, questions, probably a formal hearing. Her career could survive it. The witnesses were clear, self-defense was justified. But it would mark her, add another layer to the reputation that preceded her through every new assignment. She reached her room, stripped off the whiskey-soaked uniform, and stood under the shower letting water run over her shoulders. The hot spray did nothing to dissolve the tension in her muscles, the familiar post-action alertness that used to serve her well in hostile environments but now just felt exhausting. She thought about Vega's face in that moment before consciousness left him, the surprise and disbelief, the sudden realization that he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. She felt no satisfaction in it, no vindication, just the hollow knowledge that this cycle would repeat itself somewhere somehow with someone else who looked at her and saw only what they wanted to see. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lieutenant Marcus Reeves, her wingman, the one pilot in the squadron who'd actually taken time to review her flight record instead of just her gender. "You okay? The stories are already insane. One version has you throwing him through a window," she typed back. "I'm fine." No windows were harmed. See you at morning brief." Then she sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out the small wooden box she kept in her nightstand. Inside were the things that defined her real history. Not the medals and ribbons, those were on display, part of the official narrative. This box contained the unofficial pieces. A coin from her DEVGRU platoon, worn smooth from 6 years of operations. A photograph of her team in an undisclosed location, faces pixelated for security but bodies language clear in their easy camaraderie. A handwritten note from her former team leader, given to her the day she'd left for flight school. "You were the best operator I ever served with. Now go be the best pilot anyone ever served with." She held the coin, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. Tomorrow would bring questions, scrutiny, judgment from people who'd never faced the kind of situations she trained for. But tonight, alone in her quarters, she could acknowledge the truth that lived beneath her careful control. She was tired, tired of proving herself, tired of maintaining perfect discipline while others operated under different standards, tired of being both invisible as a person and hypervisible as a symbol. But she'd signed up for this, chosen it. And she'd see it through the same way she'd seen everything else through, one mission at a time, with precision and purpose. She replaced the coin, closed the box, and set her alarm for 0500. Tomorrow would take care of itself. Morning came with the aggressive brightness that only coastal Virginia summers could produce. Kasra was already dressed, her statement written and reviewed when Reeves knocked on her door at 0630. He held 2 cups of coffee and wore the expression of someone bearing news he wasn't sure how to deliver. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her 1 cup. "Also thought you should know there's going to be a lot of attention today. Like, a lot." Kasra sipped the coffee. It was terrible, which meant it was from the ready room pot, which meant Reeves had been there already. "How bad?" "Commander Hayes wants to see you at 0700, before the morning brief. And Colonel Whitmore's office called he wants a meeting at 0900. Reeves paused. "Also, Vega apparently has a broken jaw and a concussion. His lawyer is talking about pressing charges." Kasra felt something cold settle in her chest. Civilian charges would be different from military discipline, more complicated, more public. Did the security footage get reviewed? "Yeah, that's actually working in your favor. It's very clearly self-defense. Very clearly," but Reeves hesitated. "Nadia, where the hell did you learn to move like that? I've been in bar fights. That wasn't a bar fight. That was something else entirely." This was the moment. She could deflect, minimize, maintain the careful separation between her past and present selves. Or she could trust that Reeves had earned honesty, that 3 months of flying as her wingman had proved something about his character. "I used to do a different kind of work," she said carefully, "before I became a pilot, the kind that doesn't go on recruiting posters." Reeves studied her face, his expression shifting from curiosity to understanding. "DVGRU." She didn't confirm or deny, but her silence was answer enough. Reeves let out a long breath. "Jesus, that explains a lot, the way you move, the way you approach everything like it's a tactical problem, the way you never ever seem rattled no matter what happens." He shook his head. "Does the squadron know?" "No, it's not relevant to my current job. Except when drunk sergeants assault you and you respond with whatever that was." Reeves took a drink of his own coffee. "Look, I'm not going to spread it around, but you should probably tell Commander Hayes. It might help with context." The meeting with Commander Hayes lasted 20 minutes. Hayes was a former Tomcat pilot with a reputation for fairness and absolutely zero tolerance for nonsense. He listened to Kasra's statement, watched the security footage twice, and then leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone whose day had just become significantly more complicated. "Captain, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to be straight with me. Is there anything in your background that I should know about when I'm explaining this incident to Colonel Whitmore?" Kasra made the calculation in real time. Hayes was smart enough to have already suspected something. The footage showed capabilities that standard Navy training didn't typically produce. Better to control the narrative now than have it emerge later in less favorable circumstances. "Sir, before I was a pilot, I served with Naval Special Warfare. 6 years. I left to pursue aviation, but the training doesn't just disappear." Hayes's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "DVGRU?" "Yes, sir." "Christ." Hayes rubbed his face. "Okay, that explains the efficiency. It also makes this simultaneously better and worse. Better because you clearly weren't the aggressor and clearly had the training to respond appropriately. Worse because it's going to attract attention from people who don't understand that context." He stood, walked to his window overlooking the flight line. Two Super Hornets were taxiing toward the runway, their engines' roar muted by distance and glass. "Captain Kasra, off the record, was this response proportional to the threat?" Kasra considered her answer carefully. "Sir, my training is in rapid threat neutralization. When someone puts hands on me in an aggressive manner, my response is automatic. It's muscle memory from hundreds of hours of scenarios designed to keep me alive in the worst possible circumstances. Was it proportional? By civilian standards, maybe not. By the standards I was trained to, absolutely. I used the minimum force necessary to end the immediate threat and didn't continue after the threat was neutralized." Hayes nodded slowly. "That's going to be my position too. You defended yourself appropriately given your training and the circumstances. Vega initiated physical contact. You ended it. The fact that you ended it with extreme efficiency is a feature, not a bug." He turned back to face her. "But you need to prepare yourself. This is going to get attention. Your background is going to come out. And there are people who will have opinions about women in special operations, women in fighter cockpits, and women who can knock out men twice their size." The meeting with Colonel Whitmore at 0900 was shorter but more pointed. Whitmore was Air Wing Commander, responsible for 8 squadrons and more than 1,000 personnel. He had combat experience going back to Desert Storm, 3 carrier deployments, and a reputation for running his command with iron discipline tempered by practical wisdom. He also had political instincts that came from 26 years of navigating Navy bureaucracy. "Captain Kasra, sit." Whitmore gestured to a chair. He remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested he'd already made decisions and was now managing implementation. "I've reviewed the security footage. I've read your statement and Commander Hayes's report. I've also made some phone calls to people who know things about your previous career that most people don't." He paused, his eyes sharp. "You're a problem, Captain. Not because you did anything wrong, you didn't. But because you're about to become a story and stories have a way of taking on lives of their own." Kasra kept her expression neutral. "Sir, I defended myself. I used appropriate force. I'm prepared to answer any questions about." Whitmore held up a hand. "I'm not questioning your actions. I'm telling you about consequences. By this afternoon, every media outlet within 100 miles will have heard about this. Female pilot, former SEAL, took down a man with her bare hands. It's irresistible. And once the media gets it, the politicians will notice. And once the politicians notice, everyone with an opinion about women in combat will use you as their example of why they're right, regardless of what you actually think or what actually happened." He moved to his desk, pulled out a folder. "I'm putting you on temporary administrative duties while this gets sorted out. You're not grounded. We'll keep you current with simulators, but you're not flying real missions until this dies down. It's not punishment, it's protection, for you and for this command." Kasra felt the words like a physical blow. Not flying meant not doing her job, meant sitting on the sidelines while her squadron mates went up. "Sir, with respect, this is not a negotiation, Captain. This is me keeping you from becoming a political football while lawyers and investigators and public affairs officers figure out how to handle this." Whitmore's expression softened slightly. "You're a good pilot. According to people I trust, you were an excellent operator. None of that changes because some drunk sergeant couldn't keep his hands to himself." The media attention started that afternoon, exactly as Whitmore had predicted. A local news station ran a story: "Female Navy pilot in altercation with male sergeant." By evening, national outlets had picked it up, each with their own angle. Conservative commentators talked about women in combat and whether physical capability mattered. Liberal commentators talked about sexual harassment and self-defense. Veterans groups argued about standards and training. Everyone had an opinion. Exactly nobody asked Nadia Kasra what she thought. She watched it unfold from her quarters, scrolling through news sites and social media while her phone accumulated messages she didn't answer. Her parents called 3 times. Her sister sent worried texts. Former teammates from DEVGRU reached out with support that felt both genuine and helpless. They understood what she was experiencing but couldn't protect her from it. The worst part wasn't the attention itself. The worst part was watching herself become a symbol, watching complex reality get compressed into simplified narrative. Half the coverage treated her as a hero, proof that women could compete in any arena. The other half treated her as evidence of declining standards, suggestion that special accommodations led to incidents like this. Almost none of it treated her as a person who'd made a split-second decision in response to assault. On the third day, Staff Sergeant Vega's lawyer held a press conference. Vega appeared with his jaw wired shut, unable to speak, letting his attorney paint a picture of excessive force and violent overreaction. The attorney was careful, never claimed Vega hadn't started it, never denied he'd been drinking, just emphasized the outcome. Broken jaw, concussion, psychological trauma. A woman trained as a weapon unleashed on an intoxicated enlisted man who'd made a mistake. That evening, Commander Hayes called her to his office. He looked exhausted, the kind of tired that came from dealing with things outside his area of expertise. "Captain, I've been fielding calls all day. JAG, public affairs, congressional staffers, veterans organizations. Everyone wants something." He pulled out a bottle of scotch from his desk drawer, poured 2 glasses without asking. "The good news is that nobody serious thinks you did anything wrong. The security footage is clear. Witness statements are consistent. Even Vega's own friends admit he started it." He pushed 1 glass toward her. "The bad news is that this is bigger than facts now. It's about perceptions and politics and all the things that have nothing to do with whether you're a good pilot or whether you were justified." Kasra took the glass but didn't drink. "What happens now?" Hayes took a long pull of his scotch. "Now we wait for the investigation to conclude. Could be 2 weeks, could be 2 months. In the meantime, you stay on administrative duty, you don't talk to media, and you try to remember that this will eventually pass." He set down his glass. "I've seen careers survive worse. Hell, I've seen careers survive actual criminal charges. You'll get through this." But Kasra could read between the words. Even if she was cleared, even when she was cleared, the story would stick. Every future assignment, every fitness report, every interaction with people who'd heard her name would be colored by this moment. She'd become the pilot who knocked out a sergeant, and no amount of excellent flying would change that narrative. She thought about the box in her nightstand, the coin from her DEVGRU days, the note from her team leader. "Be the best pilot anyone ever served with." How did you do that when you weren't allowed to fly? The next morning brought a development that shifted everything. Someone leaked portions of Kasra's classified service record to a military blog. Not everything. The most sensitive operations remained protected, but enough to paint a picture. 6 years with DEVGRU. 4 deployments to undisclosed locations. Multiple decorations, including 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, all with classified citations. Training evaluations that used words like exceptional, ruthless efficiency, and natural operator. The blog post was titled "The Real Story Behind the Navy Pilot Everyone's Talking About." Within hours, it had been shared 10,000 times. The narrative started to shift. Conservative commentators who'd questioned women's physical capability suddenly had to contend with a service record that proved exceptional competence. Liberal commentators who'd focused on harassment had new evidence that the victim in this story was anything but helpless. Veterans groups that had argued about standards now faced questions about why someone with Kasra's background had ever been doubted. But the leak also created new problems. DEVGRU operations were classified for reasons. Families of operators lived under constant security concerns. The community prided itself on staying out of public attention, on being quiet professionals who did extraordinary things without seeking recognition. By exposing even limited details of her service, the leak had violated trust and protocol. Kasra's phone rang at 0600 the next morning. The number had a Pentagon prefix. Captain Kasra, this is Captain James Morrison, Naval Special Warfare Command. We need to talk about your situation. Morrison's voice carried authority tempered by something that sounded like respect. I've reviewed your record. I've talked to people who served with you. Everyone speaks highly of your operational capability and your discretion. Which is why I need to understand how your classified service history ended up on a military blog. Kasra felt her stomach tight. Sir, I had nothing to do with that leak. I've maintained operational security since I left the teams. I haven't discussed my previous service with anyone outside official channels. I believe you, Morrison said, but we need to control this situation before it gets worse. I'm authorized to offer you a temporary assignment. Come back to Dam Neck. Work with our training cadre while this investigation plays out. It gets you away from media attention, puts you in an environment where your background is understood, and gives you something productive to do. It was tempting. Return to the world she'd left behind, where her capabilities were appreciated rather than questioned, where combat effectiveness mattered more than politics. But accepting would mean stepping away from aviation, from the career path she'd chosen, from the goal of proving she could excel in this new arena. Sir, with respect, I appreciate the offer, but I'd prefer to remain with my squadron and return to flight status as soon as possible. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Captain, I'm going to be direct with you. The investigation will clear you, we both know that. But your career as a pilot is going to face challenges that have nothing to do with your capability. Every commander will wonder if you're worth the controversy. Every squadron will question whether your presence is a distraction. You'll spend the next 10 years fighting the same battles over and over, proving yourself to people who have already decided what they think. His voice softened. Come back to the community that values what you can do. We need experienced operators who can train the next generation. We need people who understand both the tactical and political dimensions of modern warfare. We need you. Kasra stood by her window, watching the morning sun illuminate the flight line. 3 Super Hornets were being prepped for a training mission she wouldn't fly. Crew chiefs moved with practiced efficiency around the aircraft, their movements choreographed by years of repetition. Sir, when I left DEVGRU, it was because I wanted to prove something, not to anyone else, to myself. I wanted to know if I could succeed in a different arena, if my capabilities extended beyond the specific skill set I'd developed. She paused, choosing words carefully. If I come back now, it'll feel like retreat, like I'm admitting that flying was just a phase, that I belong only in the shadows doing work nobody talks about. Morrison's response came with the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Captain, there's no shame in recognizing where you can make the most difference. The needs of the service sometimes diverge from our personal goals. That's not failure, that's maturity. I understand, sir, but I'd like to see this through, at least until the investigation concludes and I know what my options actually are. Fair enough. The offer stands. If circumstances change, reach out directly. Morrison paused. And Captain, stay safe. You're getting attention from people who aren't friendly. Watch your 6. The call ended, leaving Kasra with more questions than answers. What did Morrison mean by people who aren't friendly? Media attention was one thing. Active threats were something else entirely. She was still processing this when Commander Hayes appeared at her door, his expression grim. Captain, we have a problem. Sergeant Vega's attorney just filed a civilian lawsuit. Assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress. He's asking for $2 million in damages. Kasra felt the world narrow to a point. A civilian lawsuit meant civilian courts, civilian lawyers, and the possibility of financial ruin regardless of what military investigation concluded. It meant discovery, depositions, and potentially years of legal battle. It meant her service record, her personal life, and her professional decisions subjected to examination by people who understood nothing about military culture or combat training. He can't possibly win, she said, hearing the doubt in her own voice. Maybe not, Hayes agreed. But he doesn't have to win to make your life hell. The process becomes the punishment. Every news cycle will rehash it. Every potential command will see it as baggage. and even if you prevail, you'll have spent hundreds of thousands on legal defense. He sat heavily in her desk chair. This is what I meant about consequences. Vega's attorney is smart. He knows the military investigation will probably clear you. So he's opening a second front where the rules are different and the outcomes are uncertain. The next week blurred into a succession of meetings with military lawyers, civilian attorneys, and public affairs officers, all trying to manage different aspects of the expanding situation. The military investigation was proceeding on its own timeline, methodically reviewing evidence and interviewing witnesses. The civilian lawsuit was moving faster, with discovery requests and deposition schedules that demanded immediate attention. And through it all, the media coverage continued, each new development generating fresh commentary and analysis from people who'd never worn a uniform or understood what it meant to operate in gray spaces where threats moved faster than policies could track. Lieutenant Reeves became her unlikely anchor through this storm. He brought her meals when she forgot to eat, covered her administrative duties when legal appointments ran long, and provided running commentary on squadron gossip that kept her connected to the world she was fighting to rejoin. "The guys are asking about you," he said one evening, finding her in the squadron ready room long after everyone else had left. "They want to know when you're coming back." Kasra looked up from the legal documents she'd been reviewing. "What are they really asking?" Reeves had the grace to look uncomfortable. "They're asking if you're going to be a distraction, if having you back means more media, more scrutiny, more attention on the squadron." It was honest, and honesty was what she needed even when it hurt. "What do you tell them?" "I tell them you're the best pure pilot in the squadron, that your pre-flight briefings are textbook, and that I trust you more than anyone else to have my back in a furball." He sat across from her. "But I also tell them that none of that matters if the command decides you're too hot to handle. Politics beats competence every time." That night, alone in her quarters, Kasra finally let herself feel the weight of everything that had accumulated. The legal battle ahead, the career implications, the knowledge that a single 2.3-second encounter had derailed years of careful planning and flawless execution. She thought about her father, an Iranian immigrant who'd served in the Navy for 20 years and raised his daughter to believe that capability mattered more than demographics. She thought about her mother, a physician who'd fought her own battles against assumptions and lowered expectations. She thought about the promise she'd made to herself when she'd left DEVGRU, that she would excel in aviation not because of what it meant for anyone else's agenda, but because she genuinely loved flying. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks into the legal battle, a retired Navy SEAL named Jack Hendricks called her directly. Hendricks had left the service 10 years earlier and now ran a security consulting firm that trained corporate executives and military personnel in threat recognition and response. "Captain Kasra, I don't know if you remember me. I was at Dam Neck when you were going through Green Team. I watched some of your close quarters battle training." His voice carried the gravelly authority of someone who'd spent decades in violent places. "I remember," Kasra said. "Green Team was the selection and training course for DEVGRU, 6 months of the most intense preparation the military offered. I've been following your situation. That sergeant you put down. I've watched the footage about 50 times. You want to know what I see?" Hendricks didn't wait for her answer. "I see someone using minimal necessary force with maximum precision. I see someone who assessed threat, executed response, and immediately de-escalated. I see someone who did exactly what they were trained to do in exactly the way they were trained to do it, and I'm prepared to testify to that effect in whatever forum you need." Kasra felt something release in her chest. Expert testimony from someone with Hendricks's credentials could change the dynamic of the civilian lawsuit, could provide context that civilian juries would understand. "Why would you do that?" "You don't owe me anything. Because I'm tired of watching good operators get crucified for doing their jobs right," Hendricks said. "And because someone helped me once when I needed it, paying it forward." He paused. "But there's something you should know. The people pushing this lawsuit, they're not just after you. They're testing a theory. They want to establish precedent that special operations training creates liability, that the military has created weapons that are too dangerous for civilian society. If they win against you, they'll use it against every operator who transitions back to normal life. This was bigger than her personal situation. This was about whether military training could be weaponized against service members after they'd left combat roles, about whether expertise became liability instead of asset. Kasra thought about all the operators she'd known who transitioned to civilian law enforcement, security work, or ordinary lives. Every one of them carried the same training, the same muscle memory, the same reflexive responses that had kept them alive in hostile environments. If her case established that this training made them legally vulnerable, it would affect thousands of veterans. "I'll take whatever help you're offering," she told Hendricks, "and I'll fight this as long as it takes." "Good," Hendricks said, "because the community is watching, and a lot of us want to see you win." The next development came from the military side of the investigation. Captain Morrison called again, this time with news that shifted her tactical situation. "Captain Kasra, the investigation has concluded. You're cleared of all wrongdoing. The report notes that you used appropriate force given your training and the circumstances, that Sergeant Vega initiated physical contact, and that your response was consistent with defensive tactics taught to all military personnel, albeit executed with greater proficiency than typical." Morrison's voice carried satisfaction. "Furthermore, Sergeant Vega is being charged with assault and conduct unbecoming. He's probably facing a general discharge under other than honorable conditions." It should have felt like vindication. Instead, Kasra felt only weariness. The military had reached the obvious conclusion, but the civilian lawsuit remained, and with it all the complications that Morrison had originally warned about. "Sir, when can I return to flight status?" "That's going to be Colonel Whitmore's call, but I'd expect it to happen within the next week. The investigation clearing you removes the primary obstacle." Morrison paused. "Captain, I'm going to give you some advice you didn't ask for. When you get back in the cockpit, fly like your life depends on it, because your career does. Every mission, every flight, every brief, they all need to be flawless. You're going to be watched more closely than anyone else. That's not fair, but it's reality." Kasra understood. She'd be operating under a microscope, with people waiting for any mistake that would confirm their pre-existing beliefs. The standard for her would be perfection, while others operated under mere competence. It was exhausting to contemplate, but it was also familiar. It was how she'd approached every challenge since Annapolis, with the knowledge that failure wasn't just personal disappointment but confirmation of others' doubts. "Understood, sir. I'll be ready." She returned to flight status on a Tuesday morning, arriving at the squadron ready room to find the atmosphere subtly changed. Conversations died when she entered. Greetings were carefully neutral. Nobody mentioned the incident or the investigation or the media coverage that continued to simmer. They just moved around her like she was surrounded by an invisible buffer zone. Lieutenant Reeves broke the awkwardness with characteristic directness. "All right, everyone stop being weird. Kasra's back, the investigation cleared her, and we have work to do." He looked at the assembled pilots. "Anyone have a problem with that?" The silence stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Lieutenant Jake Morrison, no relation to the DEVGRU captain, spoke up. "No problem here. Good to have you back, Surgeon." The call sign had started 3 months ago, based on her precise flying style and her habit of analyzing every training mission with methodical detail. It had been half compliment, half gentle mockery. Now, hearing it again, it felt like acceptance. The others followed Morrison's lead, offering nods and brief welcomes that weren't effusive but weren't hostile either. It was what she'd hoped for, a return to normal professional relationships rather than awkward special treatment. Commander Hayes arrived for the morning brief, his presence immediately focusing attention. "All right, listen up. We have a situation developing that requires our attention. Intelligence indicates increased air activity from a non-state actor in the maritime training range. We're going to run intercept drills today, 4-ship formations, full weapons load but training missiles only." He pulled up a tactical display. "Kasra, You're leading the second flight with Reeves on your wing. Morrison and Chen are your section. I want textbook intercepts, proper geometry, communications discipline, and defensive reactions if they turn aggressive. This was both opportunity and test. Leading a four-ship flight meant responsibility for not just her own aircraft but her entire section's tactical employment. It meant making real-time decisions that would be reviewed and critiqued by everyone watching. Hayes knew exactly what he was doing, giving her a chance to demonstrate capability while ensuring any mistakes would be immediately visible. Kasra studied the tactical display, noting the projected routes and potential engagement zones. The setup was complex but manageable, the kind of scenario that separated competent pilots from excellent ones. Understood, sir. Request permission to brief my flight separately on tactical approach. Hayes nodded. 30 minutes. Wheels up at 10:00. The brief with her flight took exactly 28 minutes. Kasra walked them through the scenario, assigned roles and responsibilities, discussed contingencies and communication protocols. She could feel them evaluating her, measuring her leadership against whatever doubts or concerns they'd been harboring. When she finished, Morrison asked the question she'd been waiting for. "Surgeon, what happens if this turns into actual hostile contact?" It was a fair question. The maritime training range occasionally saw intrusions from non-military aircraft smugglers, unauthorized foreign traffic, or sometimes genuinely hostile reconnaissance. The rules of engagement were clear but required judgment calls about when defensive actions became necessary. "If we get actual hostile contact, we follow row exactly as briefed," Kasra said. "I assess threat, communicate with command authority, and execute appropriate response. Just like every other intercept mission we've ever flown, my job is to make good decisions and bring everyone home safe. Your jobs are to maintain formation integrity and follow my lead." She paused, meeting each pilot's eyes. "If anyone has concerns about my judgment, now is the time to raise them. Once we're airborne, we're committed." The silence that followed carried weight. Chen, the most junior pilot in the formation, spoke first. "No concerns here, ma'am. Let's fly." Morrison and Reeves nodded agreement. It wasn't enthusiastic trust. That would take time and shared experience. But it was professional acceptance, which was all she needed. The pre-flight walk-around of her Super Hornet was ritual and reassurance. Kasra moved around the aircraft with practiced efficiency, checking control surfaces, inspecting weapons pylons, verifying that every system was properly configured. Her crew chief, aviation machinist's mate First Class Roberto Diaz, watched with the critical eye of someone who'd been maintaining aircraft for 15 years. "She's ready, Captain," Diaz said. "I gave her extra attention. Want you to have a good flight." The simple kindness of it, the acknowledgement that he'd put in extra effort because he wanted her to succeed, was unexpectedly moving. Kasra nodded, not trusting her voice for a moment. "Thanks, Diaz. I'll bring her back clean." The climb into the cockpit was coming home. Whatever complications existed on the ground, whatever legal battles and media scrutiny and political calculations surrounded her career, up here it was just physics and training, and the pure challenge of flying a $40 million fighter jet with precision and skill. The engine start sequence was symphony. The whine of generators spooling up, the rumble as the engines ignited, the subtle vibration through the airframe as systems came online, and the aircraft transformed from inert machine to controlled violence waiting for release. "Ocean Control, Viper 2-1 flight of 4, requesting taxi clearance." Kasra's voice was calm, professional, giving no indication of the tension she'd been carrying for weeks. "Viper 2-1, Ocean Control, cleared to taxi runway 27 via taxiway Alpha. Wind 240 at 12 knots, altimeter 299er2. The formation taxied in proper sequence, 4 Super Hornets moving with mechanical precision toward the runway. Kasra ran through her final checks, verifying that every system showed green, that her flight was properly aligned behind her, that she was mentally and physically prepared for whatever the next 2 hours would bring. The takeoff roll compressed the world into acceleration and noise. Kasra watched her airspeed indicator climb 80 knots, 100, 120, 140 end rotated at exactly the calculated speed, feeling the Super Hornet leap off the runway with eager grace. The gear came up. The flaps retracted, and suddenly she was flying again, really flying, with 3 other aircraft tucked into perfect formation and the Virginia coast dropping away behind her. Viper flight switched tactical frequency. Her flight acknowledged, their radios clicking to the discrete frequency that would control this mission. Cass returned southeast, climbing through 5,000 feet toward the maritime training range where their intercept targets waited. The next 30 minutes would define whether her return to flight status was genuine rehabilitation or just political theater. Commander Hayes and Colonel Whitmore would both be watching the data feeds from their aircraft. Every radio transmission would be recorded and reviewed. Every tactical decision would be analyzed and critiqued. But up here, none of that mattered as much as the mission itself. She had a flight to lead, intercepts to execute, and her own standards to maintain regardless of what anyone else expected. The tactical display showed 2 contact groups ahead, their transponders indicating they were playing the role of unidentified aircraft requiring investigation. The scenario was designed to test judgment as much as flying skill, when to close, when to maintain distance, how to assess hostile intent without creating unnecessary escalation. Cass keyed her radio. Viper 2-1 flight tactical spread formation. Morrison and Chen high cover. Reeves, you're with me on the intercept. The formation shifted, Morrison and Chen climbing to 15,000 feet while Kasra and Reeves descended to 8,000 for the initial approach. Contact bearing 135, 60 miles, tracking west at 300 knots, Ocean Control transmitted. Viper 2-1, you're cleared for investigation. Kasra adjusted her heading, bringing her nose to point directly at the contact. Reeves, right echelon formation, 1,000-foot spacing. 2, Reeves acknowledged, his Super Hornet sliding into position off her right wing. The distance to contact closed rapidly 50 miles, 40, 30. At 20 miles, Kasra began her radio calls. Unknown aircraft, this is United States Navy fighter on your position. You are approaching restricted airspace. Identify yourself and state your intentions. No response. The contact continued its westward track, maintaining altitude and speed. At 10 miles, Kasra could see the aircraft visually, a twin-engine civilian aircraft, possibly a business jet with no visible markings. Its flight path would take it directly through the restricted zone unless it altered course immediately. Unknown aircraft, this is United States Navy fighter. You are entering restricted airspace. Alter your course to heading 270 immediately. Still no response. This was the decision point. Under normal circumstances, the protocol was to make close visual contact, attempt to establish radio communication on guard frequency, and signal the aircraft to follow if communication failed. But something felt wrong. The aircraft's behavior was too deliberate, its course too precise. It wasn't wandering into restricted space accidentally, it was driving straight towards something. Kasra checked her tactical display. Morrison and Chen were positioned high and behind, ready to respond if this went sideways. Ocean Control was monitoring but staying quiet, letting her handle the tactical picture. She was exactly where every test pilot wants to be in a situation that required judgment, with the authority to make decisions and the responsibility to get them right. Reeves, we're going close aboard. I'll take left side, you take right. If he deviates toward either of us, break opposite and maintain 1,000-foot separation. 2 copies. Kasra added power, the twin engines responding instantly, accelerating her Super Hornet from 380 knots to 450 in seconds. The distance closed 5 miles, 3-1. At half a mile, she began her offset maneuver, sliding left and forward until she was flying parallel to the unidentified aircraft, close enough to see details through her canopy. The aircraft was definitely a business jet, but something was wrong with its configuration. The windows were darkened beyond normal tinting, and what should have been smooth fuselage showed irregularities that suggested modifications. More concerning, the pilot's reaction to her presence was wrong. Instead of showing surprise or taking evasive action, The jet maintained perfect course and speed, as if her 30-ton fighter aircraft materializing off its wingtip was expected and irrelevant. Ocean Control Viper 2-1 has visual on unknown aircraft. Single business jet appears to be modified, no visible registration, no radio response. Pilot is not acknowledging visual signals. Kasra rocked her wings, the international signal for follow me. The business jet didn't respond. She tried again. Nothing. This was beyond normal civilian confusion. This was deliberate disregard of military intercept protocol, and it was happening in restricted airspace during active operations. Something was very wrong. Reeves, you seeing this? Yeah, he knows we're here, he just doesn't care. Reeves's voice carried concern. Surgeon, this doesn't feel like a lost civilian, Kasra agreed. Her combat experience, both in the air and on the ground, had taught her to trust instincts when observable facts didn't align with expected behavior. This aircraft was either remotely piloted, crewed by people who understood exactly what they were doing, or both. Ocean Control Viper 2-1 requesting guidance. Unknown aircraft is non-responsive and maintaining course into restricted area. Recommend we treat this as potential hostile contact. There was a pause, 3 seconds that felt like 30. Then Hayes's voice came over the frequency, clear and direct. Viper 2-1, Ocean Control. Be advised, we have intelligence indicating possible hostile reconnaissance in your area. You are authorized to treat unknown aircraft as hostile if it continues into restricted zone. Execute intercept per rules of engagement. That changed everything. Hostile meant different protocols, different authorities, different responses. It meant that what had started as a training exercise had become something real, with real consequences for getting it wrong. Kasra checked her weapons systems. She was carrying training missiles, but she also had 500 rounds of 20mm ammunition in her cannon. Against an unarmed business jet, the cannon would be devastating if she needed to use it. She hoped she wouldn't need to use it. Morrison Chen, collapse formation and prepare for defensive response. Unknown aircraft is now designated hostile. Her flight responded immediately, Morrison and Chen dropping from their high cover position to establish a defensive bracket around Kasra and Reeves. 4 Super Hornets against 1 business jet should have been overwhelming force, but Kasra's training screamed warnings. Overwhelming force only mattered if you understood the threat, and she didn't understand what this aircraft was doing or what capabilities it might have. The business jet crossed into restricted airspace. Kasra made one more radio call, following protocol even though she expected no response. Unknown aircraft, you have entered restricted United States military airspace. You are ordered to exit immediately or be subject to defensive action. The business jet continued its track, now 3 miles inside the restricted boundary and still driving towards something Kasra couldn't identify. Hayes came back on frequency. Viper 2-1, you are authorized to fire warning shots. Aim for safe separation and attempt to signal hostile to break off. Warning shots meant putting rounds into space where the business jet could see them but wouldn't be hit, unless they did something stupid, in which case their stupidity became their problem. Kasra toggled her weapon selector to guns, saw the sight picture appear on her heads-up display, and made rapid calculations about geometry and safe separation. Reeves, I'm firing warning burst. Maintain your position and watch for break. 2. Kasra pulled ahead of the business jet, established separation, and then rolled inverted and pulled her nose down, bringing her gun sight into alignment with empty air 1,000 feet in front of the target. The cannon fired with characteristic vibration, sending a 2-second burst of 20mm rounds across the business jet's flight path. Tracers marked the path of the shells, unmistakable against the blue sky. Any pilot who saw that would understand the message. Turn around or the next burst won't be a warning. The business jet didn't even flinch. It flew straight through the space where Kasra's tracers had been, maintaining course and speed with mechanical precision. Either the pilot had nerves of absolute steel, or there was no pilot at all. Ocean Control Viper 2-1, warning shots fired. No response from hostile aircraft. requesting additional guidance. The pause this time was longer. She could imagine the conversations happening in the control room, Hayes consulting with intelligence officers, legal advisors, command authority. The decision about what happened next would involve people far above her pay grade. While she waited, Kasra maintained formation with the hostile aircraft, her Super Hornet positioned where she could react immediately if the situation deteriorated. Through her canopy, she studied the business jet's behavior, looking for any indication of intent or capability that would help her understand what she was dealing with. That's when she saw the panel on the underside of the fuselage begin to open. All aircraft, Viper 2-1. Hostile aircraft is deploying something from Ventral Bay. Defensive spread now. Her flight reacted instantly, Morrison and Chen breaking hard left while Reeves went right with Kasra. Whatever was coming out of that business jet could be anything from surveillance equipment to actual weapons, and she wasn't waiting to find out which. The object that emerged from the bay was cylindrical, maybe 6 feet long, with stubby wings that deployed as it dropped free. It accelerated rapidly, tracking toward the ocean surface with the unmistakable behavior of a powered drone or missile. Ocean Control, Viper 2-1. Hostile has deployed unknown object, appears to be UAV or cruise missile tracking downward towards surface. Hayes' response was immediate. All Viper aircraft, you are weapons free. Repeat, weapons free. Engage and destroy hostile aircraft and any deployed objects. Morrison, Chen, engage the deployed object. Reeves, you're with me on the business jet. Let's end this. Kasra rolled her Super Hornet hard right, pulling 6 GS in a turn that brought her nose pointing at the business jet. Her weapons selector was still on guns. Training missiles were useless against a non-maneuvering target, but her cannon would do just fine. The business jet was still maintaining its course, apparently unconcerned that 4 fighter aircraft were now actively targeting it. Either it had completed its mission and didn't care what happened next, or it had other capabilities it hadn't revealed yet. Kasra didn't give it time to reveal anything. She established proper gun parameters range, angle, closure rate, and fired a sustained burst directly into the business jet's center fuselage. The 20mm round struck with devastating effect. The business jet's fuselage ruptured, control surfaces separated, and the aircraft began an immediate descent that would end only when it hit the ocean surface. No explosion, no fire, just structural failure and the inevitable fall. Viper 2-1, hostile aircraft destroyed. Morrison, Chen, status on the deployed object. Viper 2-3, we're tracking it but it's low and fast. Chen's moving into firing position now. Kasra rolled her aircraft to watch the developing engagement. The deployed object, definitely a powered drone of some kind, was skimming the ocean surface at maybe 50 feet, still heading towards something in the restricted zone. Chen's Super Hornet dove toward it, establishing the difficult geometry required for an air-to-surface gun engagement. The first burst missed, rounds impacting the water and creating geysers that marked Chen's aim point. She adjusted, fired again, and this time found her target. The drone disintegrated, pieces scattering across the ocean in a debris field that would keep investigators busy for weeks. Ocean Control, Viper flight. Both hostile aircraft and deployed object destroyed. Debris impact approximately 15 miles southeast of Point Charlie. Request instructions. Hayes' voice carried satisfaction mixed with concern. Viper flight, outstanding work. RTB and prepare for immediate debrief. We're scrambling recovery assets to the impact area. This is now a classified incident, no discussion outside official channels until debriefed. The flight back to Oceana felt surreal. Kasra had just engaged and destroyed a hostile aircraft over United States airspace for the first time in her career. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by the methodical process of reviewing her decisions and preparing for the scrutiny that would inevitably follow. Reeves's voice came over their discreet frequency. "Surgeon, that was textbook. You made every right call at every decision point." "Remains to be seen what the debrief concludes," Kasra said. "But thanks," she meant it. Having her wingman's confidence mattered more than she'd realized until this moment. The debrief lasted 4 hours. Commander Hayes, Colonel Whitmore, intelligence officers, legal advisors, and representatives from 3 different Pentagon offices all wanted detailed accounts of every moment from initial contact to weapons employment. Kasra walked them through it methodically: the initial intercept, the unresponsive behavior, the deliberate entry into restricted space, the deployment of the unknown object, and her decision to engage after receiving weapons-free authorization. She included her assessment that the business jet's behavior indicated either remote operation or a crew following precise instructions regardless of consequences. The questions came rapid fire. Why hadn't she tried additional warning measures? What made her confident the aircraft was hostile? How certain was she that engagement was necessary? Kasra answered each question the same way she'd been trained to answer questions in DEVGRU after-action reviews: with facts, observed behavior, and clear reasoning chains that showed how she'd reached each decision. The turning point came when they reviewed the recovered debris. Intelligence officers had pulled fragments from both the business jet and the deployed drone from the ocean. The business jet had been modified for remote operation, with no human crew aboard. The drone had been configured for maritime surveillance, carrying cameras and electronic monitoring equipment designed to collect intelligence on naval operations in the training range. Someone had been conducting reconnaissance against United States naval forces, using an uncrewed aircraft to penetrate restricted space and deploy a sophisticated surveillance platform. Kasra's intercept had prevented that reconnaissance from succeeding. Colonel Whitmore delivered the conclusion. Captain Kasra, based on the evidence and your detailed account, I'm ruling this a justified engagement of hostile reconnaissance assets. Your decisions showed appropriate judgment, proper escalation of force, and effective tactical employment of your flight. Well done. The simple praise from a senior officer who'd been skeptical of her return to flight status carried unexpected weight. Kasra felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged until it disappeared. She'd been tested, not by training scenarios but by actual hostile contact, and she'd performed exactly as expected. The next day brought new complications. The civilian lawsuit from Sergeant Vega's attorney suddenly gained new dimensions when media outlets reported that the pilot being sued for excessive force had just shot down an aircraft over American airspace. Conservative commentators who'd questioned her presence in combat roles suddenly had to reconcile that skepticism with the fact that she'd successfully defended restricted airspace against hostile reconnaissance. Liberal commentators who'd focused on self-defense found their narrative complicated by the reality that their symbol of harassment resistance was also a combat pilot with confirmed kills. And veterans groups that had argued about standards discovered that the woman at the center of their debate had just validated her training in the most concrete way possible. Vega's attorney tried to use the engagement as evidence of dangerous propensities. Look at how quickly she escalated to lethal force, how comfortable she was with violence, how her military training made her a threat even in civilian contexts. But Jack Hendricks, the retired SEAL who'd offered to testify on her behalf, immediately recognized the opportunity. "Captain Kasra, they just handed us the case," Hendricks said when he called 2 days after the engagement. "They're arguing that your military training makes you dangerous. You just used that exact training to protect American airspace. Any jury is going to see the difference between appropriate defensive response and inappropriate violence." He paused. "More importantly, they're going to see that you're still serving, still doing the job, still putting yourself in situations where those responses are necessary. That's not a liability. That's a credential." The legal momentum began to shift. Vega's attorney, recognizing that continued pursuit of the lawsuit would look increasingly like attacking a decorated combat pilot for defending herself, started making noises about settlement. The terms were confidential, but the practical effect was clear: the lawsuit would be dismissed, Vega would receive minimal compensation, and Kasra's legal exposure would end. It wasn't complete vindication. The settlement would prevent some people from ever acknowledging that she'd been entirely justified in her response to assault. But it was resolution, and resolution meant she could stop fighting legal battles and focus on flying. Commander Hayes called her into his office 3 days after the lawsuit settled. "Captain Kasra, I have new orders for you. You're being reassigned." Kasra felt her stomach drop. Reassignment could mean anything from punishment posting to prestigious command, and Hayes's neutral expression gave nothing away. "Where, sir?" Hayes smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in months. "Fighter Weapons School. They want you as an instructor. Apparently, successfully engaging hostile reconnaissance over American airspace is exactly the kind of recent combat experience they value in their training cadre." Fighter Weapons School, known universally as Top Gun, was the Navy's premier training program for fighter pilots. Being selected as an instructor was recognition that you were among the best tactical aviators in the service, capable of not just flying superbly but teaching others how to do the same. It was career validation of the highest order. "Sir, thank you. When do I report?" "You have 3 months to wrap up here and prepare for the move to Fallen. Use the time wisely. Get some rest. Spend time with people who matter, because once you're at weapons school, the pace will be relentless and the standards will be unforgiving." Hayes stood, extended his hand. "Captain, you've had a hell of a few months. You handled it with more grace than most people could have managed. You should be proud." Kasra shook his hand, feeling the weight of everything that had happened since that night in the officers' club when a drunk sergeant had thrown a drink on her uniform. The investigation, the lawsuit, the media scrutiny, the doubt and the defense, and the constant pressure to prove herself worthy of the uniform she wore. And through all of it, she'd kept flying, kept maintaining standards, kept demonstrating the competence that should have spoken for itself but somehow never quite did. The next 3 months passed in a blur of final flights, farewell gatherings, and preparation for the move to Nevada. Lieutenant Reeves organized a send-off that managed to be respectful without being maudlin, the squadron gathering to present her with a plaque commemorating her engagement of hostile reconnaissance assets. The inscription read simply, "Captain Nadia Kasra, call sign Surgeon, defended restricted airspace with precision and purpose. One opportunity, one engagement, one outcome." It was the kind of recognition that mattered more than public praise or media attention acknowledgement, from the people who understood exactly what she'd done and why it mattered. On her last day at Oceana, Kasra found herself back in the officers' club where everything had started. The space looked different in afternoon sunlight, less dramatic than it had been that night when whiskey and broken glass had forced decisions that cascaded into months of consequence. She sat at the same corner table, drinking coffee instead of anything stronger, and thought about the path that had brought her from that moment to this one. Staff Sergeant Vega had been administratively separated from the Navy, his career ended by his own poor judgment and inability to maintain professional standards. She'd heard he'd found work in private security, far from the military community that had rejected him. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, just the hollow recognition that his actions had set events in motion neither of them could have predicted. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jack Hendricks. "Heard about Top Gun. Well deserved. If you ever need anything, reach out. The community remembers its own." The community. She'd left DEVGRU to pursue aviation, but the skills and mindset and relationships from those 6 years remained part of her identity. They'd shaped how she approached every challenge, how she assessed threats, how she made decisions under pressure. They'd also made her a target for people who thought women didn't belong in combat roles, who saw her capabilities as evidence of declining standards rather than individual excellence. But they'd also proved invaluable when situations required judgment and precision. The business jet engagement had validated every hour of training she'd received, every operational experience she'd accumulated. It had shown that the skills transferred across domains, that competence in one arena translated to competence in others. She finished her coffee and stood, taking one last look around the officers' club. Somewhere in this building, Security footage still existed of the 2.3-second encounter that had derailed and then ultimately defined her career trajectory. Future officers would probably watch it in classes about use of force and professional conduct, using her actions as case study for discussion and debate. She hoped they'd learn the right lessons. Not that violence was admirable or that responding to provocation with force was optimal, but that sometimes situations required immediate action, that training mattered, and that competence should speak louder than demographics. Fighter Weapons School exceeded every expectation she'd built during the 3-month transition. The pace was relentless, the standards unforgiving, and the intellectual challenge of teaching tactical aviation to pilots who were already excellent required her to elevate her own understanding to new levels. Captain Jake Morrison, who'd become Viper after his own stint as a Top Gun student, ran the school with the same combination of intensity and precision that characterized the best military training institutions. He assembled his instructor cadre based on recent combat experience, teaching ability, and demonstrated tactical excellence. Kasra's engagement of hostile reconnaissance assets had earned her a place in that cadre, but staying there required proving every day that she belonged. The first time she stood in front of a classroom full of experienced fighter pilots, she felt the familiar assessment happening. Eyes evaluated her credentials, her bearing, her authority to teach them anything about air combat. She didn't try to win them over with charm or inspiration. She just started teaching, breaking down complex tactical situations into component decisions, illustrating with examples from her own flights, challenging their assumptions about optimal responses to threat scenarios. 15 minutes into her first lecture, she saw the shift happen. They stopped evaluating her gender and started evaluating her knowledge. She'd cleared the bar that every instructor had to clear, demonstrating that she knew more about the subject than her students did. 3 months into her assignment, Morrison called her into his office. "Kasra, I'm putting you in charge of the close quarters intercept module. You're going to teach students how to handle ambiguous contacts at short range, when to close, when to maintain distance, how to read hostile intent before it becomes hostile action." It was recognition that her experience with the business jet engagement had taught lessons beyond just the specific scenario. It was acknowledgement that her judgment under pressure had value that could be transmitted to other pilots. The module became her signature contribution to the school. She developed scenarios that pushed students to make decisions with incomplete information, forced them to balance aggressive response against escalation risk, taught them to trust their training while remaining flexible enough to adapt to unexpected developments. And she told them the story of the business jet, not as heroic narrative but as case study in decision-making. "I made 3 critical assessments in that engagement," she would tell each class. First, that the aircraft's behavior indicated hostile intent before it took any overtly hostile action. Second, that warning measures were unlikely to change its behavior and might cost time we couldn't afford to lose. Third, that waiting for perfect information would mean waiting too long. She'd pause, making eye contact with students who were scribbling notes or watching her with focused attention. Any one of those assessments could have been wrong. If I'd been wrong, I'd have shot down a civilian aircraft having radio problems. My career would have ended, probably facing criminal charges. The only reason I'm standing here teaching you instead of sitting in a federal prison is that I was right." The honesty resonated. Students who'd expected theoretical instruction found themselves learning from someone who'd actually faced the situations they trained for, who'd actually made life-and-death decisions with imperfect information and limited time. One student, a young lieutenant with the call sign Rookie, raised his hand during a Q&A session. "Ma'am, how do you trust yourself in those situations? How do you know you're making the right call?" Kasra considered the question carefully. "You don't know. That's the hard truth. You make the best assessment you can with the information available, you apply your training and experience, and you execute your decision with commitment. Sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. The only thing you can control is the quality of your decision-making process." She smiled slightly. "Also, you stay current with training. You review every mission. You learn from mistakes and successes. You build a foundation of experience that lets you make accurate assessments quickly. There's no shortcut to that foundation. It's just repetition and honest evaluation and constant refinement. The class ended with better understanding of decision-making under uncertainty, which was exactly the outcome Morrison had wanted when he'd assigned her the module. After 2 years at Fighter Weapons School, Captain Morrison called Kasra into his office with news that would shape the next phase of her career. You're being promoted to major and assigned as executive officer of a Super Hornet squadron deploying to the Pacific. It's a high-profile assignment, joint operations with allied forces, complex threat environment, significant political attention. The promotion to major felt like vindication delayed but finally delivered. The assignment as XO second in command of a squadron meant recognition that her leadership capability matched her tactical skill. And deployment to the Pacific meant operating in the most strategically important region in the world, where American naval power balanced against emerging peer competitors. She reported to VFA 147, the Argonauts, 6 months before their scheduled deployment. The squadron commander was Commander David Walsh, a former Tomcat pilot with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for aggressive tactics tempered by careful judgment. Their first meeting lasted 30 minutes and covered everything from maintenance philosophy to tactical doctrine to expectations for squadron culture. "Major Kasra, I know your history," Walsh said without preamble. "The incident at Oceana, the lawsuit, the business jet engagement, Top Gun instructor. I've read your fitness reports and talked to people who have flown with you. Here's what I care about. Can you run the day-to-day operations of this squadron so I can focus on tactical planning and command decisions?" It was refreshingly direct. No careful diplomacy, no avoidance of uncomfortable topics, just clear expectations and practical focus. "Sir, I can run operations. I can maintain aircraft readiness, manage personnel issues, coordinate training schedules, and ensure this squadron is prepared for deployment. That's what an XO does, and I've been preparing for this responsibility for 10 years. Walsh nodded. "Good. Then let's get to work. We deploy in 6 months, and we have significant readiness deficiencies to address before then." The 6 months passed in intensive preparation. Kasra threw herself into the XO role with the same methodical intensity she'd brought to every previous assignment. She identified maintenance bottlenecks and fixed them. She developed training schedules that maximized flight hours while respecting crew rest requirements. She dealt with personnel issues ranging from marital problems affecting performance to junior officers questioning their career choices. It was unglamorous work, the kind of administrative leadership that never made headlines but determined whether squadrons succeeded or failed in actual operations. And it taught her things about leadership that tactical flying never had: how to balance competing priorities, how to maintain standards while showing flexibility, how to develop junior personnel while managing senior egos. The deployment began with a transit to Naval Air Station Atsugi in Japan, where the Argonauts would operate for the next 8 months. The squadron brought 12 Super Hornets, 20 pilots, and 160 maintenance personnel. They would fly missions throughout the Pacific, participate in joint exercises with Japanese, South Korean, and Australian forces, and maintain continuous readiness for contingency operations. 3 weeks into deployment, Commander Walsh called Kasra into his office. "Major, we have a situation developing. Chinese maritime forces are harassing Philippine vessels near Second Thomas Shoal. Philippine government has requested American support under our Mutual Defense Treaty. We're being tasked to fly presence patrols in the area, basically show up, be visible, demonstrate commitment to freedom of navigation." It was exactly the kind of mission that could escalate from routine presence to actual confrontation if anyone miscalculated. The South China Sea was contested water, with China claiming sovereignty over areas that international law recognized as Philippine territory. American patrols supported Allied interests but also risked direct confrontation with Chinese forces. "Sir, rules of engagement?" Kasra asked. Standard defensive protocols. We don't initiate contact, but we defend ourselves and our allies if engaged. We maintain professional conduct, follow international law, and don't create incidents. But we also don't back down from legitimate operations. Walsh pulled up a map showing the operational area. I'm sending you to lead the first patrol. For ship flight, you pick your pilots. 12-hour mission, 8 hours on station. Expect close encounters with Chinese fighters and surveillance aircraft. Make good decisions, keep everyone safe, accomplish the mission. This was command authority, not just flying as part of someone else's plan, but having responsibility for tactical decisions that would affect international relations and potentially lead to combat. Kasra selected her flight carefully. Reeves, who'd followed his own path to the squadron, Morrison, the lieutenant from Oceana who'd become Viper at Top Gun, and Chen, who developed into an excellent tactical pilot after the business jet engagement. All three had experience with complex intercepts and ambiguous situations. The brief took an hour, covering everything from diplomatic constraints to defensive reactions to communication protocols. The mission was simple in concept: fly to 2nd Thomas Shoal, establish patrol pattern, observe Chinese activity, support Philippine vessels, return to base. But execution would require constant judgment calls about proximity, response to Chinese challenges, and escalation management. The flight launched at 0600 local time, 4 Super Hornets loaded with full weapons complement including live missiles. This wasn't training. If situations deteriorated, they would defend themselves with lethal force. The transit to the operational area took 90 minutes, flying south through international airspace over increasingly contested waters. At 100 miles from 2nd Thomas Shoal, Chinese air traffic control began broadcasting warnings. Military aircraft approaching Chinese territorial waters, you are entering restricted airspace. Alter your course immediately. Kasra responded with the scripted language that State Department and military lawyers had developed for exactly this situation. Chinese air traffic control. This is United States Navy flight in international airspace conducting freedom of navigation operations consistent with international law. We do not recognize territorial claims inconsistent with United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. The Chinese controller's response was immediate. United States flight, you are violating Chinese sovereignty. Fighter aircraft are being scrambled to intercept. You will comply with our instructions or face consequences. Kasra switched to discrete frequency to brief her flight. All aircraft, expect Chinese intercepts. Maintain professional conduct, follow row exactly, do not create incidents, but also do not yield right-of-way or acknowledge illegitimate territorial claims. At 50 miles from the shoal, her radar painted 4 contacts climbing from what she knew was a Chinese airbase on an artificial island. The contacts accelerated, establishing intercept geometry that would bring them face to face with her flight in approximately 10 minutes. This was the moment when political policy became tactical reality, when abstract principles about freedom of navigation transformed into 4 American pilots and 4 Chinese pilots meeting in contested airspace with weapons and authority to use them if necessary. Kasra checked her systems, verified her flight was properly positioned, and prepared for the kind of encounter that required equal parts tactical skill and diplomatic judgment. The Chinese fighters closed fast J-16s, modern twin-engine aircraft roughly equivalent to American F-15s. Capable aircraft flown by increasingly skilled pilots operating under instructions that probably included, don't start a war but don't back down. The 2 formations merged at 20,000 feet over water that China claimed but international law disputed. The Chinese fighters established close formation with Kasra's flight uncomfortably close, within a few hundred feet, positions that would be considered dangerous in peacetime, but that served as intimidation and demonstration of capability. United States aircraft, you are ordered to leave Chinese airspace immediately, came the call on guard frequency. The Chinese pilot's English was heavily accented but perfectly understandable. Kasra responded calmly. Chinese aircraft. We are operating in international airspace conducting lawful operations. We will maintain our assigned patrol pattern. Please maintain safe separation consistent with international aviation standards. What happened next would be reported in competing ways by Chinese and American media, analyzed by defense experts with different political perspectives, and used as evidence for opposing views about presence operations and escalation risks. But the objective facts recorded by multiple aircraft sensors told a clear story. The Chinese lead fighter accelerated suddenly, cutting directly in front of Kasra's Super Hornet with less than 200 feet of separation, a dangerous maneuver that could have resulted in collision if either pilot miscalculated. Kasra reacted instantly, pulling her nose up and rolling left to avoid the crossing aircraft. Her formation stayed with her, maintaining integrity despite the aggressive Chinese maneuver. She keyed her radio, keeping her voice level despite adrenaline surging through her system. Chinese aircraft, your maneuver was dangerous and unprofessional. Maintain safe separation, or we will report this as harassment inconsistent with international aviation standards. The Chinese pilot's response came with heat. United States aircraft, you are the ones engaging in dangerous provocation. Leave Chinese airspace now. Kasra made a decision. Backing off would signal that aggressive maneuvers could push American aircraft away from legitimate operations. Escalating would risk actual conflict. Threading that needle required doing exactly what they'd briefed, maintaining their patrol pattern professionally while documenting every dangerous Chinese action. Reeves, Morrison, Chen, maintain patrol pattern. Stay tight on defensive spacing. Document everything. We're not leaving, but we're also not playing chicken. Her flight acknowledged. The Chinese fighters continued aggressive maneuvers, high-speed passes, close formation flying, attempts to position in ways that would force American aircraft to deviate from their planned route. Through it all, Kasra maintained the patrol pattern, keeping her formation together, responding to each Chinese maneuver with professional defensive flying that yielded no ground but created no additional escalation. After 2 hours of this carefully choreographed aggression, the Chinese fighters broke off and returned to base, presumably low on fuel. Kasra's flight continued their patrol for another 6 hours, observing Chinese maritime forces operating near Second Thomas Shoal, but maintaining distance from the Philippine vessel they were ostensibly supporting. When they finally returned to Atsugi after 12 hours airborne, Commander Walsh was waiting in the ready room with intelligence officers, operational commanders, and a video feed to Pacific Fleet headquarters. The debrief lasted 3 hours, with senior officers asking detailed questions about every Chinese maneuver, every communication, every tactical decision. Kasra walked them through it methodically, her flight backing up every detail with their own observations and recorded data. Admiral Patricia Morrison, no relation to the lieutenant, commanded 7th Fleet and had responsibility for all naval operations in the Western Pacific. She appeared on the video feed with the expression of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. Major Kasra, your flight handled a difficult situation with exactly the professionalism and judgment we needed. The Chinese are testing our resolve, seeing if aggressive tactics will push us out of areas where we have legitimate operational interests. You demonstrated that professional persistence beats aggressive posturing. The Admiral paused. But I need you to understand something. This was day one of what's going to be a sustained campaign. The Chinese will continue these harassment tactics. They'll get more aggressive if they think it's working, back off if they think it's counterproductive. Your job is to maintain that middle path, not backing down, not escalating, just persistent professional presence that demonstrates American commitment to freedom of navigation. It was acknowledgement that tactical actions had strategic implications, that decisions she made in the cockpit rippled through diplomatic channels and affected international perceptions of American resolve. Over the next 6 months, Kasra flew dozens more patrols in the South China Sea, each one a careful dance between presence and provocation. She developed expertise in reading Chinese tactics, understanding which maneuvers were genuinely dangerous versus merely aggressive, knowing when to document harassment versus when to let minor incidents pass without creating diplomatic complications. The squadron's maintenance personnel worked brutal hours keeping aircraft flying despite the demanding operational tempo. Junior pilots gained experience managing ambiguous situations where rules of engagement provided framework but not specific answers. Senior enlisted personnel dealt with the stress of deployment while maintaining the focus necessary for complex flight operations. And through it all, Kasra fulfilled the XO role coordinating operations, managing personnel issues, maintaining readiness, ensuring that the unglamorous administrative work that enabled tactical success continued without disruption. 6 months into deployment, Commander Walsh called her into his office with news that would change both their situations. "Major, I've been selected for promotion to captain and reassignment to staff duty at Pacific Fleet Headquarters. I'll be leaving the squadron in 30 days. He paused, measuring her reaction. "I've recommended you to take command. That recommendation has been endorsed by everyone in the chain above me, including Admiral Morrison. Congratulations, Commander Kasra. You're going to be the Argonaut's new co." Taking command of a fighter squadron was the goal that every tactical aviator worked toward, the culmination of years of training, multiple deployments, proven leadership capability, and demonstrated tactical excellence. It was also enormous responsibility. Everything the squadron did or failed to do would be her responsibility. Every pilot's safety, every aircraft's readiness, every mission's success. Walsh spent the next 30 days conducting turnover, walking her through the nuances of squadron command that went beyond what she'd learned as XO. How to balance competing demands from different commanders. How to manage maintainers who were exhausted but needed to keep working. How to handle a pilot who was struggling but hadn't yet failed badly enough to warrant grounding. How to maintain your own tactical proficiency while dealing with administrative burdens that could consume every waking hour. The change of command ceremony was brief but emotionally significant. In front of the assembled squadron, Walsh read the orders transferring authority to Kasra, then symbolically passed her the squadron flag. She gave short remarks focused on continuing the Argonauts' tradition of excellence, maintaining readiness despite operational tempo, and taking care of people who made everything else possible. Then she was the commanding officer, responsible for 12 aircraft and 180 personnel, and every mission the Argonauts would fly until someone relieved her. The squadron deployed again 4 months later, this time to the Persian Gulf. The strategic situation in the Middle East had deteriorated, with Iranian forces harassing commercial shipping and threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz. The Argonauts would operate from a carrier in the Arabian Sea, flying missions to protect freedom of navigation and deter Iranian aggression. Commander Kasrashi was still adjusting to the rank after her promotion from major, stood on the carrier flight deck watching her squadron's aircraft being repositioned for the next day's operations. The smell of jet fuel, the controlled chaos of flight deck operations, the ever-present danger of working around aircraft and machinery capable of killing anyone who made a mistake, it was the environment she'd lived in for 15 years, but now with the additional weight of command responsibility. Her operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chang, found her near the island's superstructure. "Skipper, morning brief is at 0530. Intel has new information about Iranian small boat activity in the strait. Could affect our patrol routes." "I'll be there," Kasra said. She'd learned not to micromanage her department heads, to trust that her officers would handle their responsibilities while keeping her informed of issues requiring her attention. The next morning's intelligence brief showed increasing Iranian activity, small boats swarming commercial vessels, drones surveilling American naval forces, occasional provocative maneuvers by Iranian fighters. The pattern suggested they were probing for reactions, testing American resolve, looking for opportunities to create incidents that could be spun as American aggression. The Carrier Air Wing Commander, Captain Michael Torres, addressed the assembled squadron commanders. We're entering a period where tactical decisions could have strategic consequences. Iranian forces are looking for any excuse to claim they're defending against American provocation. Our job is to maintain freedom of navigation without giving them that excuse. He looked directly at Kasra. Commander Kasra, your squadron will fly the first patrol into the strait tomorrow. 4 aircraft, A-tower mission. Expect harassment from Iranian small boats, possible interception by Iranian fighters. Rules of engagement are standard defensive protocols. You may defend yourself and any commercial vessels under harassment, but you do not initiate contact. It was essentially the same mission she'd flown dozens of times in the South China Sea, just with different adversaries and slightly different political context. The brief for her flight took longer than usual, lots of contingencies to consider, multiple scenarios to plan for, various authorities and restrictions to understand. Kasra walked her pilots through decision trees. If Iranian boats approach commercial vessels, we do this. If Iranian fighters intercept, we do this. If we receive hostile fire, we do this. Each scenario had its own rules, its own authorities, its own potential for escalation or de-escalation depending on how they responded. Lieutenant Marcus Reeves, who'd followed his own path to the Argonauts and was now one of her most experienced pilots, raised a practical concern. Skipper, the political situation is different from the South China Sea. Chinese forces were aggressive but ultimately professional. Iranian forces have shown willingness to actually open fire on vessels in international waters. Are we prepared for that possibility? It was a fair question that required honest answer. Yes, we're prepared. We have weapons, authority to use them in self-defense, and clear rules of engagement. But we're also going to do everything possible to avoid situations where defensive response becomes necessary. Professional conduct, clear communication, maintaining distance when possible. The goal is deterrence through presence, not combat through provocation. The flight launched at 0600, 4 Super Hornets carrying full weapons loads including anti-ship missiles, air-to-air missiles, and guns. The transit to the Strait of Hormuz took 40 minutes, flying north from the carrier's position in the Arabian Sea. As they approached the strait, Iranian air defense radar began tracking them, the electronic warfare systems in each aircraft detecting the Iranian radar's emissions and categorizing them by type and threat level. At 30 miles from the strait, Iranian air traffic control began broadcasting warnings similar to what Kasra had heard from Chinese controllers months earlier. Military aircraft approaching Iranian territorial waters, you are entering restricted airspace. Alter your course immediately. Kasra gave the scripted response about international waters and freedom of navigation. The Iranian controller's reply came with more heat than she'd heard from Chinese counterparts. American aircraft, you are engaging in illegal aggression against the Islamic Republic. Fighter aircraft are launching to defend our sovereignty. Any hostile action will be met with defensive response. The Iranian fighters appeared on radar 90 seconds later. 2 F-4 Phantoms, American-made aircraft from the 1970s that Iran had maintained through decades of sanctions and isolation. Capable aircraft in their day, but significantly outmatched by modern Super Hornets in every performance parameter. The Phantoms climbed toward intercept geometry, but their approach was less aggressive than Kasra had expected. Instead of high-speed intercept, they established formation several miles away, packing her flight but not closing to harassment range. Interesting, Reeves commented on discrete frequency. They're respecting separation. Maybe they're not looking for confrontation today. Kasra watched her tactical display, noting the Iranian fighters' positions and flight paths. The lack of aggressive maneuvering suggested Iranian command authority had given instructions to observe rather than harass, probably collecting intelligence on American patrol patterns and aircraft capabilities. Stay alert, she told her flight. Just because they're playing nice right now doesn't mean circumstances won't change. The patrol continued for 2 hours with the Iranian Phantoms maintaining distant observation. Kasra's flight documented commercial vessel traffic through the strait, noted positions of Iranian small boats and naval vessels, and generally demonstrated American presence without creating incidents. Then the situation changed. A commercial tanker flagged in Panama but carrying Saudi oil broadcast distress on maritime frequencies. Mayday, Mayday, this is merchant vessel Bright Fortune. We are being approached by multiple small boats at high speed. Request immediate assistance. Kasra checked her tactical display. The Bright Fortune was 15 miles ahead, and her radar showed multiple small contacts converging on the tanker's position. This was exactly the scenario they'd briefed Iranian harassment of commercial shipping requiring American response. Reeves, Chen, you're with me. Morrison, maintain position and watch our 6. All aircraft, weapons tight unless I call weapons free. Her 3 Super Hornets accelerated, diving from altitude toward the surface where the drama was unfolding. The Iranian Phantoms reacted immediately, their positions shifting to follow Kasra's movement, observing, tracking, probably reporting everything to their command authority. At 10 miles, Kasra could see the situation visually. 5 Iranian small boats, fast attack craft armed with machine guns and possibly anti-ship missiles, were circling the Bright Fortune in a pattern that clearly indicated harassment rather than legitimate inspection. The tanker was attempting to maintain course, but the small boats were forcing it to alter heading through aggressive maneuvering. This was interdiction, potentially piracy, definitely illegal under international maritime law. Kasra made the radio call on maritime distress frequency. Iranian vessels harassing merchant vessel Bright Fortune. This is United States Navy flight. You are engaging in illegal harassment of commercial shipping in international waters. Break off immediately and allow the merchant vessel to proceed. The Iranian response came not from the small boats but from shore-based command. American aircraft, you are interfering with legitimate Iranian law enforcement operations. Maintain distance or face consequences. This was the decision point. Backing off would signal that Iranian harassment could proceed unchallenged. Engaging would risk escalation to actual combat with unpredictable consequences. Threading that needle meant doing exactly what she'd done in the South China Sea: professional persistence, clear documentation, measured response. All aircraft were doing a low pass over the merchant vessel. Show presence, demonstrate commitment, see if that changes their behavior. Stay together, watch for anti-aircraft fire, defensive reactions only. The 3 Super Hornets descended to 500 feet, accelerated to 400 knots, and roared directly over the Bright Fortune in a display of air power that left absolutely no ambiguity about American presence and capability. The noise alone, 3 sets of twin engines at full military power, was enough to make anyone on those small boats reconsider their course of action. The Iranian boats scattered, breaking off their harassment and heading back toward Iranian territorial waters at high speed. The Bright Fortune continued its transit through the strait, its crew probably shaken but safe, and the Iranian Phantoms maintained their distant observation, not interfering but documenting everything for their command authority. Kasra climbed back to patrol altitude, her heart rate elevated but her voice steady. Maritime Authority, this is United States Navy flight. Iranian vessels have broken off harassment. Merchant vessel Bright Fortune is proceeding safely through the strait. The response came from the carrier, where commanders had been monitoring the situation in real time. Outstanding work. Continue patrol as briefed. The rest of the mission passed without additional incidents, but Kasra knew this encounter would generate analysis and discussion throughout the command chain. She'd used minimum necessary force-just presence and implied capability to achieve the mission objective of protecting commercial shipping. But she'd also demonstrated American willingness to intervene directly in situations where Iranian forces were harassing vessels in international waters. That demonstration would have consequences, both positive and negative. The debrief on the carrier lasted 4 hours, with increasingly senior officers joining as word of the incident spread. Captain Torres, the Air Wing commander, led the discussion with his characteristic blend of tactical focus and political awareness. Commander Kasra, you handled that situation exactly right. Minimum force, clear communication, achieved objective without escalation. But you need to understand that your actions today just raise the stakes for every subsequent patrol. He pulled up a map showing the strait and surrounding waters. Iranian forces will analyze what happened, develop countermeasures, and probably try different tactics next time. They might send more boats, might position anti-aircraft defenses in ways that make low passes more dangerous, might have their fighters take more aggressive positions. This is the beginning of a cycle, not the end of an incident. Admiral Kevin Richardson, commanding the Carrier Strike Group, appeared on video feed from Flag Bridge. Commander, I've briefed 5th Fleet and Central Command on today's events. Everyone agrees you made the right calls, but we're now in a period of heightened tension. Iranian leadership is probably debating how to respond. They might back off, might escalate, might do something unpredictable. Your squadron needs to be prepared for all possibilities. It was a reminder that tactical success didn't guarantee strategic stability, that sometimes accomplishing a mission well created new challenges rather than resolving existing ones. Kasra acknowledged the guidance and returned to her squadron spaces, where her pilots and maintenance personnel were waiting for word about what had happened and what it meant for future operations. She gathered them in the ready room, all 80 personnel who were currently aboard the carrier. The others were back at shore base managing aircraft that weren't deployed. Today we protected a commercial vessel from illegal harassment by Iranian forces. We did it professionally, with minimum force, and we brought everyone home safe. That's the standard we maintain. Accomplish the mission without unnecessary escalation, protect American interests and allied shipping, fly smart and come home. She paused, looking at the faces watching her with varying degrees of experience and confidence. But that mission just made our lives more complicated. Iranian forces now know we'll intervene directly to protect shipping. They're going to adapt, probably become more aggressive or more careful or both. Every patrol from now on needs to treat Iranian contact as potentially hostile, not just potentially difficult. Over the next 8 weeks, the pattern Admiral Richardson had predicted unfolded exactly as expected. Iranian forces adapted their tactics, becoming more cautious about direct harassment, but finding new ways to create ambiguous situations. They'd position small boats near commercial vessels without actually approaching, making it unclear whether they were threatening or just operating nearby. They'd have fighters establish closer formations with American patrols, not quite dangerous but definitely more aggressive than before. They'd test response times and procedures, probing for weaknesses or opportunities. And through it all, the Argonauts maintained their patrol schedule for aircraft, 8-hour missions, constant presence in the strait. The operational tempo was brutal. Pilots flew every other day. Maintainers worked 16-hour shifts keeping aircraft ready, the entire squadron operating at a pace that couldn't be sustained indefinitely, but was necessary while tensions remained high. Kasra felt the weight of command in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every maintenance issue became her problem, not just the technical challenge, but the decision about whether an aircraft was safe to fly or should be grounded. Every pilot struggling with fatigue or family issues back home became her responsibility to manage. Every mission that launched was her decision to risk 12 lives and one $40 million aircraft for objectives that politicians and diplomats defined. She found herself thinking about the box she'd kept at Oceana, the one with the DEVGRU coin and the photograph, and the note from her old team leader. Be the best pilot anyone ever served with. She'd achieved that goal in terms of pure flying skill, tactical knowledge, mission accomplishments. But she was learning that best meant more than individual excellence. It meant creating conditions where everyone in your command could perform at their best, where the sum of collective effort exceeded what any individual could accomplish alone. The crisis point came 11 weeks into the deployment. Intelligence indicated that Iranian leadership had made a decision to challenge American presence operations more aggressively, potentially including direct engagement of American aircraft. The warning came from national-level sources: satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence, human sources whose identities and methods were so sensitive that only summaries of their reporting reached operational commanders. Admiral Richardson summoned all strike group commanders to Flag Bridge for secure briefing. Kasra attended via video feed from the ready room, her presence required even though she couldn't physically leave the squadron spaces while they were at flight operations tempo. Ladies and gentlemen, the intelligence picture has changed significantly. Richardson began without preamble. We have high confidence reporting that Iranian leadership has authorized their air defense forces to fire on American aircraft conducting patrol operations in the Strait of Hormuz. This authorization includes both ground-based air defense systems and fighter aircraft. He let that sink in for a moment. The Strait of Hormuz had been contested space for decades, but actual shooting between American and Iranian forces was rare and always carried risk of broader conflict. Our orders from Central Command are clear: continue freedom of navigation operations, maintain protective presence for commercial shipping, defend ourselves and merchant vessels if engaged, but do not initiate hostilities under any circumstances. Richardson looked directly at the video feed where Kasra's image appeared. Commander Kasra, your squadron will fly the first patrol under these new conditions. Tomorrow morning, 0600 launch. We're providing additional support: E-2 Hawkeye for airborne early warning, EA-18 Growler for electronic warfare support, and backup aircraft on strip alert in case things go sideways. But you'll still be making tactical decisions in real time, probably without opportunity to consult higher authority if situations develop quickly. It was simultaneously vote of confidence and burden of responsibility. Richardson was trusting her to handle potentially combat situations with appropriate judgment, but he was also putting her squadron in the most dangerous position, first into an environment where American aircraft might actually face hostile fire. The brief for tomorrow's mission took 3 hours and involved more personnel than any previous patrol. Intelligence officers provided detailed analysis of Iranian air defense systems, their capabilities and limitations, the tactics they'd used in previous conflicts. Electronic warfare specialists explained how the Growler would suppress Iranian radars if hostilities began. The E-2 Hawkeye crew discussed how they'd provide early warning of Iranian fighter launches and coordinate any defensive response. And Kasra walked her 4 pilots through every scenario she could imagine, every decision point where split-second judgment might mean the difference between successful deterrence and escalating combat. Our job hasn't changed, she told them. Protect commercial shipping, maintain freedom of navigation, follow rules of engagement. The only difference is that Iranian forces might actually shoot at us this time. If that happens, we defend ourselves with full authority under Roe, we communicate clearly so everyone knows what's happening, and we don't stop until the threat is neutralized or we're ordered to disengage. Lieutenant Chen, who'd been with Kasra since the business jet engagement years ago, asked the question everyone was thinking. Skipper, are we ready for actual combat? Not training, not harassment, but real shooting where people die if we make mistakes. Kasra looked at her pilots, seeing the combination of confidence and concern that any rational person would feel before potentially entering combat. Yes, we're ready. We've trained for this. We have better aircraft, better weapons, better training than anything Iranian forces can field. But ready doesn't mean invincible. It means we execute our training, make good decisions, and take care of each other. That's all we can control. The flight launched at exactly 0600, 4 Super Hornets in tactical formation, with the Growler and Hawkeye providing support from different altitudes. The transit to the strait felt different this time, heavier somehow, weighted with the knowledge that this might be the patrol where theory became reality. Iranian air traffic control began their warnings as expected. Iranian air defense radars began tracking the flight as they approached the strait. But this time, the electronic warfare officers in the Growler noted something different. The Iranian radars were using targeting modes, not just surveillance tracking. They were establishing firing solutions. Viper Flight Weasel 11 came the call from the Growler crew using their call sign. Be advised, we're seeing Iranian air defense systems transitioning to engagement modes. They're setting up to shoot. This was the moment. Iranian forces moving from observation to active targeting meant they were preparing to execute the authorization that intelligence had warned about. Kasra had seconds to decide how to respond. She made the call to the E-2 Hawkeye, Skyhawk, Viper 1, requesting immediate tactical picture and threat assessment. Viper 1, Skyhawk. We hold 2 Iranian fighter aircraft launching from Bandar Abbas airfield, probably F-4s. ETA your position 12 minutes. Multiple ground-based air defense systems are active along the coast, tracking your formation. Assessment is they're preparing coordinated engagement fighters to force you into air defense envelope, SAMs to prosecute once you're in range. The tactical picture was clear. Iranian forces were setting up an ambush, trying to maneuver American aircraft into position where ground-based missiles could engage effectively, while fighters pressured them into those kill zones. It was competent tactical planning that showed Iranian forces had studied American patrol patterns and developed countermeasures. Kasra had 2 options. She could abort the patrol, return to the carrier, and report that Iranian forces had successfully deterred American presence operations through threat of engagement. Or she could continue the mission, accepting increased risk but demonstrating that American commitment to freedom of navigation wouldn't be negated by Iranian threats. The decision took 3 seconds. All aircraft were continuing the patrol. Modify route to maintain maximum distance from Iranian air defense systems while staying in international waters. Defensive posture weapons armed, prepared for immediate defensive response if engaged. Skyhawk, maintain continuous threat updates. The flight adjusted course, threading between Iranian territorial waters, where air defense coverage was strongest, and the shipping lanes they were supposed to protect. It was tactical navigation with life-or-death consequences, finding the narrow path where they could accomplish the mission without unnecessarily exposing themselves to Iranian fires. The Iranian F-4 Phantoms arrived exactly on schedule, establishing aggressive formation positions much closer than previous intercepts had shown. The lead Iranian pilot made the radio call that Kasra had been expecting. American aircraft, you are in Iranian targeting envelope. Any deviation from current course will be considered hostile action and will result in defensive engagement. It was threat and constraint simultaneously. Stay on this specific path or we'll fire. The problem was that this specific path would take her flight directly toward the most concentrated Iranian air defense coverage, exactly where the SAMs were optimally positioned. Classic squeeze play fighters pushing from one direction, air defenses waiting in the other direction. American aircraft forced to choose between retreat and exposure. Kasra made her decision. Iranian aircraft, we are operating in international airspace conducting lawful freedom of navigation operations. We will maintain our right to free navigation and will not accept flight restrictions from forces making illegitimate territorial claims. Then, on discrete frequency to her flight, tactical split. Chen and Morrison, maintain current heading and altitude. Reeves, you're with me, we're going low and fast to the east, away from the air defense concentration. Force them to choose which element to pursue. It was classic tactical deception. By splitting her formation, she created multiple problems for Iranian command authority. They couldn't effectively target both elements simultaneously. Whichever element they pursued, the other would continue the patrol mission. And pursuing either element meant exposing their own aircraft to American defensive response. The Iranian Phantoms hesitated, probably waiting for instructions from ground control about how to respond to the split formation. That 2-second hesitation gave Kasra's flight the separation they needed. She and Reeves dove toward the surface, accelerating to 450 knots while descending to 500 feet above the water. Chen and Morrison maintained altitude and course, continuing toward the strait as if nothing had changed. The Iranian lead Phantom made his choice pursuing the high element, probably because it was maintaining course toward the objective, and therefore represented the primary threat to Iranian interests. But that left Kasra and Reeves essentially free to maneuver, low and fast below most of the Iranian air defense coverage. "Skipper, that was brilliant," Reeves commented on discrete frequency. "You just gave them an impossible tactical problem." "Don't celebrate yet," Kasra replied. "We still have to accomplish the mission and get everyone home, and those air defense systems are still active." The patrol continued for another 6 hours, with Iranian forces maintaining aggressive posture but never quite crossing the line into actual engagement. The F-4 Phantom stayed close to Chen and Morrison's element, occasionally making threatening maneuvers but not opening fire. Ground-based air defenses tracked both elements but didn't launch missiles. And through it all, Kasra maintained the patrol pattern, documenting commercial vessel traffic, demonstrating American presence, refusing to yield to Iranian pressure tactics. When the flight finally returned to the carrier after 8 hours airborne, Kasra was physically and mentally exhausted in ways that pure flying never caused. The constant tactical decision-making, the responsibility for 4 aircraft and 4 lives, the knowledge that any mistake could trigger combat with strategic implications. It was draining in ways that physical exertion could never match. Admiral Richardson was waiting in the ready room with half the strike group staff. "Commander Kasra, that was exceptional tactical decision-making. You refused to be pushed out, refused to be maneuvered into a kill box, and accomplished the mission while avoiding escalation. That's exactly the kind of judgment we need in this environment." But Richardson's expression also carried concern. "You also demonstrated that Iranian threats don't deter American operations. That's good for our policy objectives, but potentially bad for escalation management. Iranian leadership now knows they need more aggressive tactics if they want to actually stop our patrols. This is likely to get worse before it gets better." The prediction proved accurate. Over the next 4 weeks, Iranian forces became increasingly aggressive. They positioned air defense systems closer to international waters, flew fighters in more dangerous formations, and eventually fired warning shots missiles launched without guidance toward American aircraft, intended to demonstrate capability and resolve without actually attempting to hit. Each incident required careful response strong enough to demonstrate that American operations would continue, restrained enough to avoid triggering broader conflict. Kasra flew every mission personally, unwilling to ask her pilots to face risks she wouldn't accept herself. The physical toll was manageable. She was in excellent condition and had years of experience with demanding flight operations. But the psychological weight of command responsibility, the constant decision-making under pressure, the knowledge that her choices affected not just tactical outcomes but strategic stability, that weight accumulated until she found herself lying awake in her rack at night, running through mission replays and alternative decisions, questioning whether she'd made optimal choices or just adequate ones. 6 months into the deployment, the situation finally stabilized. Iranian leadership apparently concluded that aggressive harassment wasn't preventing American operations and was probably increasing rather than decreasing American presence in the region. The tactics shifted back toward observation and distant monitoring, creating a tense equilibrium that both sides could maintain indefinitely. The Argonauts completed their deployment and returned to home station with maintenance readiness at 89% exceptional given the operational tempo and 0 mishaps, despite hundreds of flight hours in contested airspace. Commander Kasra stood on the pier watching her squadron's aircraft being offloaded from the carrier, each Super Hornet showing the wear of 8 months of intensive operations, but still fundamentally sound and ready for the next cycle. Captain Torres approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone about to deliver news that would change circumstances. "Commander, I have your next assignment. You're being promoted to captain and assigned as Deputy Operations Officer for 3rd Fleet. It's a staff position, which I know isn't your preference, but it's also a necessary step if you want to eventually command an air wing." Promotion to captain was significant, the rank where officers transitioned from tactical command to strategic leadership, from flying missions to shaping policy about what missions got flown. The assignment to 3rd Fleet staff meant leaving squadron command, leaving regular flying, entering the world of operational planning and resource allocation and political coordination that determined what tactical commanders could actually accomplish. It should have felt like success, and it did, in ways Kasra recognized intellectually. She'd commanded a squadron through successful deployment in contested environment. She demonstrated leadership, tactical judgment, and ability to operate under intense pressure. She'd earned recognition from senior officers who'd watched her handle situations that could have gone disastrously wrong. But it also felt like moving away from the work she loved: actual flying, tactical problem-solving, the immediate feedback of accomplishing missions, and bringing everyone home. Staff work would be important but abstract, influential but removed from direct action. Tors read her expression accurately. "I know it's not what you choose, but the Navy doesn't keep promoting people to keep doing the same job they're already good at. We promote them to take on bigger responsibilities, shape strategy instead of just executing it. You've proved you can command a squadron. Now you need to prove you can operate at the level where squadrons get tasked and resourced and integrated into broader operational plans." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Also, between us, you've attracted attention. The business jet engagement, Top Gun instructor, squadron command in contested environment. You're on a list of officers being watched for potential flag rank. That's good for your career, but also creates expectations. You need the staff experience to be credible for those future assignments. Flag rank, Admiral." It was the ambition that no officer would voice publicly, but many harbored privately. The pinnacle of military career, the position where you shaped force structure and employment policy and national strategy. Kasra had never let herself consciously pursue that goal. She'd focused on excellence in each assignment, on being the best at whatever job she currently held. But she'd also known in the back of her mind that excellence created opportunities and that opportunities accumulated into trajectories. "When do I report?" she asked Tors. 3 months. Use the time to transition command properly, take some leave, spend time with people who matter. Staff work has different demands: more travel, more meetings, more coordination with people outside the military chain. Different skill set. The change of command ceremony was both celebration and farewell. Kasra transferred authority to her relief, a commander named Robert Chen who'd served as operations officer in another Super Hornet squadron and had been carefully selected for squadron command based on his own record of excellence. She gave remarks that focused on the squadron's accomplishments, the deployment they'd completed, the missions they'd flown, the standard they'd maintained. She thanked her pilots and maintainers and support personnel for making her look good through their collective competence. And she acknowledged the weight they'd all carried, the tension of operating in contested space where mistakes could trigger international incidents, the pride of maintaining American presence despite pressure and provocation. The squadron presented her with a plaque showing all the missions they'd flown under her command, each one represented by a small symbol on a map of the Pacific and Middle East. It was visual representation of the work they'd done together, the risks they'd accepted, the objectives they'd accomplished. She would keep it on her desk through every future assignment, reminder of the time when she'd been responsible for actual operations instead of just planning and coordination. The staff assignment at 3rd Fleet Headquarters was exactly as Tors had warned: important but abstract, influential but removed from direct action. Captain Kasra spent her days in meetings about force,